Today's meeting is about Black Lives Matter. It is a fortunate that Poplar and Limehouse constituents, BAME Forum has organized this meeting, and I would like to warm welcome you all, especially the guest speakers, Poplar and Limehouse MP Afsana Begum. Welcome, Afsana. Asad Rahman from, I believe, Newham. Welcome, Asad Rahman, and Zita, other speaker. However, to me, every single person is speaker for tonight's meeting. We shall try to recommend as much people as possible just to have their say, so that we can have their advice, we can share our concern and what step we can take regarding these issues. Ever since I have came to this country, that is an ongoing issue, and it will never end. I reckon it will never end until the world is end. And we as BAME community should firmly stand together to fight against these fascists and racists. And particularly at the moment, I call that very proudly, there are institutional racism is round. So we got to be aware, and we all need, every participant is valid to us. Thank you very much.
Right, if I can now move on to our first speaker, Zita Olborn, who is a poet and an activist and also a Labour member. Zita, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So just a bit about me. Yeah, I'm a Labour Party member and activist. I'm the national chair of Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, Barrack UK, which is 10 years old now. We just celebrated our 10-year birthday, and we're an organisation that campaigns against austerity, against racism, against injustice. We use the term black in Barrack in its broadest, the full name Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, in its broadest political sense to encompass what some people may term people of colour or BAME people. I don't really like the term BAME, but I am actually in organisations that use that term. So Barrack is also part of an organisation called BAME Lawyers for Justice, which is a group of lawyers and campaigners who have been campaigning on issues of injustice on race grounds in the UK for many years together. But in recent years, we've been joined by all of the Windrush justice groups across the country, and we've been focused on the Windrush generation and related issues around the hostile environment and deportations and immigration issues, the attacks on migrant communities. And I'm also a trade unionist. I'm the National Vice President of the Public and Commercial Services Union and the Joint National Chair of the Artists Union England. So in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen out protesting across the UK in recent weeks and globally, of course, starting in the USA following George Floyd's horrific murder, which was played out on many people's screens across the world. But for a lot of people, they didn't watch that video because it's traumatic, because a lot of people have had to live through that kind of abuse firsthand, or their families have experienced it, and actually it's triggering excuse me, to have to watch something like that. So whilst you know, the seeing that video caused the pain and anger which led to people taking to the streets and protesting, people have been protesting under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter, either officially or unofficially, because there's an official Black Lives Matter organisation in the USA and there is in the UK. But what we're seeing is mostly people in lots of different local areas and local communities and different cities and towns using the Black Lives Matter slogan to come together and organize against racism. And a lot of people think that in the UK, people are protesting purely in solidarity with what's happening in America. But that isn't true. There've been a huge number of deaths at the hands of the state in the UK. My organisation and my union have been involved for many years in supporting family justice campaigns, people who, families who are fighting for justice for loved ones who have died at the hands of the state. There's the United Family and Friends campaign that brings all of those families together, who organise an annual march against deaths in custody every year at the end of October from Trafalgar Square to Downing Street, and we've been supporting many of the families there over the years. The last 10 years we've seen of austerity have deepened race discrimination that all Black and migrant communities have faced, whether as workers or service users or in local communities. But the Black Lives Matter movement is focused largely on Afrophobia, or specifically on Afrophobia. So the discrimination that is particularly targeting people from the African diaspora. But of course, there is racism facing all people of colour in the UK and other migrant communities. Systemic and institutional racism, everyday racism, and racism that's been fueled by the rise of the far right and fascist groups, not just in the UK, across Europe. We see them in the USA as well, and actually in Brazil in more recent years, and other countries. So this is a broad movement, a global movement against racism. And some people are saying that at the moment, that, you know, this is a turning point. What's happening currently is a turning point in race relations. But I have been around a long time fighting racism, to be a bit more cynical about that. You know, and I'm not convinced that it's a turning point. I think that it could be a turning point, but it's how we make that happen and how we work collectively together and holding those who have the power to task. And what we're seeing at the moment, aren't we, is a lot of corporate organisations and institutions and businesses now declaring that Black Lives Matter. And they're putting out statements declaring their anti-racist credentials. But the same organisations that for decades and maybe even a century, if they're very old established organisations, would have been allowing racism to happen in their own organisations, both as employers and also in service provision, and doing nothing about the racism right under their noses, or doing very little and paying lip service. Because, you know, some people having a debate now about, do we need to strengthen legislation? Do we need to bring in different policies? Well, actually, we have law, we have established legislation, you know, to protect us on grounds of race, but the reality, it doesn't, because of the way it's used and because of the judicial system, and about how power and privilege are used to stop it being successful. So I don't actually think we need more or new legislation or policies. We need to use the ones that exist the correct way, and they're not used the exist way. What we actually need to do as well is to get rid of racist policies and racist law, not least the Immigration Act that we have in place. And this is something that my organisation, Barrack, have long campaigned against. We established in 2012 an organisation called Movement Against Xenophobia with other race and migrant groups in the UK, campaigning organisations, to oppose what was then the immigration bill. And actually, it sailed through Parliament, and with the exception of a very small handful of MPs in the Labour Party, which included John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, you could kind of count on, you know, one hand the MPs that supported us. It went through. And at the time, you will probably recall that the Labour Party had this merchandise that was anti-immigrant merchandise as well, which was quite horrendous. So they allowed that legislation to come through. And we were warning at that time in 2012 that this wasn't just going to affect new migrants. It wasn't just going to affect overseas students. It was going to affect our communities, African and Caribbean and Asian communities, established communities that have been here for 2 or 3 generations or even more in the UK, who came from Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries. And effectively, that is what happened. The Windrush scandal, you know, exposed what was happening. But we were saying that, warning that that was going to happen from time. And that's part of the problem. Even, you know, people warn that this type of racism here is going to happen, or that type of racism, people don't get up and mobilize and really react to it until it's happening right, you know, they're right in the middle of it and it's happening to them. So there's a lot more we need to do to respond to things, to stop things. It's much easier to block things before they come in than it is to undo things once they're established and they're part of a system. And one of the things we've seen, haven't we, in recent weeks is the conversation that's not a new conversation, but it's happening as part of that Black Lives Matter movement about the legacies of colonialism and enslavement. And, you know, the dismantling of the Colston statue has led to a whole host of other statues being taken down, including one in Tower Hamlets outside a museum that I used to take my son to frequently when he was a small child. Some of those statues have been taken down to protect the statues, not because of the offence and that they cause to people, but it is starting a debate. And in PCS, it's the largest civil service union, and we've actually been negotiating with the government. I'm on the national trade union side. We've been negotiating over the last couple of weeks or so on Black Lives Matter, but also the disproportionate impacts of COVID on BAME communities. And that's another thing, that when we're talking about Black lives and what we do about our lives as migrant communities, as Black and brown people, and the discrimination we face in the UK, systemic discrimination, the reason why we are dying disproportionately is because of discrimination that's been in the UK for a long time. And what we're seeing is this type of othering of us and labeling of us and trying to shift the blame to us and saying, well, you're dying and you're contracting coronavirus more than any other group because of your lifestyles and because of your health problems. So it's a pointing the finger at us, and actually we need to counter that, because it's about poverty, poor housing, discrimination in the labour market and in wider society, and the fact that we're more likely to be in frontline jobs, in precarious jobs, in insecure work, on low pay, where we face discrimination, where they haven't provided proper health and safety provisions even before coronavirus came in, and certainly not after it came in. And it's our communities, it's migrant communities, and you know the children, descendants of migrants to the UK that have kept essential services running over the last few months, you know, and making sure those essential services were there and in place for people in the NHS, in public transport, in refuge collection, in essential services, in a whole host of different roles, particularly in cities like London, you know, and in boroughs like Tower Hamlets. And so I think we can't separate that out from everything else we're talking about, race discrimination. They're all part of the same problem. But what we have to do is to really pin down employers and institutions and service providers in our local communities and wider, and indeed the Labour Party. And I don't know, you know, what people think about what Keir Starmer said yesterday in describing the Black Lives Matter movement as a moment, which I found to be really, really insulting and offensive, to reduce centuries of oppression and the response to centuries of oppression and the impact on you know, descendants of people who were enslaved and you know, the victims of colonialism, to then turn around and say this is just a moment, to me shows that he has a complete misunderstanding of racism, and actually is not taking racism seriously or even caring about the racism that we're facing. And for me, that's a problem as a Labour Party member, that we have somebody heading up the party with that kind of view of racism. And there is racism within the Labour Party. You know, the Labour Party, like any political party, is an institution. So we have to root that racism out, because whilst, you know, if we're going out saying everybody else needs to tackle racism, well, I'm not saying us as individuals, but the Labour Party itself is criticising people outside for racism, it needs to get its own house in order as well. And that goes for everybody. Everybody, whether it's the trade union movement, whether it's political parties, whether it's local authorities, everybody needs to get its own house in order if we're serious about tackling racism and creating a positive legacy for the next generation. And that's what saddens me about all of this, is that, you know, my parents' generation faced those no blacks, no Irish, no dog signs. I've spent my entire life fighting racism and campaigning against racism and injustice faced by our communities. And we now have another generation of young people that are out on the streets having to protest, actually at a time when I prefer they weren't out protesting, because of the fact that Black people and BAME people are dying disproportionately. You know, I think it puts people at risk and at danger. And for that reason, Barrack and my organisation haven't called any protests, because one of the things we're campaigning on is for employers not to force people back into workplaces and put them at risk at dying, and to actually put measures and processes in place to do individual risk assessments, equality impact assessments, and ensure that people don't have to go into workplaces, that they can work from home or do something different and be paid if they are in a high risk group. And also not just looking at the risk to those workers when they get to a workplace, but the risk to other workers of them going to work. You know, and a lot of our community will be in the low paid jobs and in the precarious roles like the security guards. When a building opens up, if it's a local authority or a civil service department, that building opens, the cleaners come in, the caterers come in, the security guards come in, and they're all people that are dying disproportionately, and they're more likely to be migrant workers and Black and Asian workers. And also that means more people get on public transport, and public transport workers and taxi drivers are dying disproportionately as well. So it puts those workers at risk. So yes, we have an opportunity. Is my time up?
I'll go in another room.
Oh, I thought that was somebody telling me my time was up. I'm sure my time is up actually. So I'm going
to. Zita,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. So basically, I need to keep an eye on the time. So you've got another minute to wrap up this. Yeah.
1 minute. Okay.
Finish this meeting by 9:30.
We have an opportunity to bring about some real change. I think. You know, we have a responsibility to the next generation, but we also have to hold to account those who have the power, those who have the privilege, the institutions, the government, to actually bring about some positive change and do something real. And actually, there should be nothing about us without us. And that means they have to consult us, they have to engage with us, and they have to listen to us, because we're the ones that live and breathe racism and have that first-hand experience, not only of going through racism every day, but also on how to challenge it and how to tackle it, because we've had to do that to survive. We have to teach our children how to do that to survive as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zita, for your nice speech. So if you bear with us, well, I'm sure a lot of the participants will have questions for you. So now I'm going to actually go into the next speaker, which is the which is Asad Rahman from the New Monitoring Project. He's a nationally well-recognized figure, anti-racist campaigner. So Asad Rahman, over to you.
Thank you, brother, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you this evening, and Assalamu alaikum to everybody. As Zita has very powerfully said, you know, we're in this moment that Keir has talked about is not a moment. It is what some of us would say centuries of struggle expressing itself. Of course, the trigger has been the murder of George Floyd in the US. And of course, since he was killed, we've seen countless other people who've lost their lives at the hands of the US police. And of course, in the US, it started a huge conversation, both about, not just about policing, but actually a broader conversation about systems of oppression. And as we've seen here in the UK, it triggered something quite profound, a much needed, actually, discussion about racism in the UK and the story that Britain tells itself, right? I think that challenge about what is the story that Britain tells itself, that racism is a problem somewhere else, that Britain has been this, you know, bastion of liberalism and individual rights, and yes, there is some tiny minority that might be the far right, but generally as a country we're a very, very tolerant country. Of course, that's not, when we look at how racism is embedded within our societies, we see that that's not the true story, right? The story of slavery, colonialism, of imperialism, of neoliberalism, you know, is the story of Britain. And we can pay tribute. I mean, we're all from East London. I live in Newham, in Forest Gate, you know, and, you know, we can go back to the 1700s, right? And we can talk about the Lascars, the seafarers, the Asian seafarers. We could talk about, you know, the East India Company, you know, which used to dock its ships at Blackwall, you know, the company that, and the history of that colonialism, which, you know, during just the Raj itself, just during the Raj, not in taking any of the exploitation that it did across the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, or anything else, you know, took 45 trillion out of the Indian subcontinent, you know, to the bricks and mortar of this country, that British traders enslaved 1.5 million people of African descent. And the equivalent profit of that was £8 billion. It said in the 1770s that Britain used to have about £4 million invested into its economy each and every year. Something like 3.8 million of that was from slave profits. We could say that Britain developed, that, you know, it was the global South that developed Britain. And that, of course, isn't just a story of the past. It's a story of the present, the economic systems that Britain sits at the center of. The reason why Britain is the 5th richest country in the world is not because of some profound ingenuity of the British people, or so. It's because Britain was, you know, historically a much more violent and brutal and much more efficient colonizer than anybody else. And, you know, just since, for example, since the 1980s, from the 1980s to now, it's calculated that something like 16 trillion pounds has flowed from the global South to the global North, to rich countries, because of the unfair trade system that we've created, the ownership of resources and of commodities and resources. We can look at the map of, for example, of the African continent during colonialism and slavery, and look at the role of Britain, of France, of Italy, and Germany, and we can map that with a map that today, and it will tell you that the same British companies control now 101 companies that sit in the city of London, control £1 trillion worth of Africa's resources, more than the entire GDP of every sub-Saharan African country put together. So racism isn't something that's just about this moment. It's really about both the past and the present. And I think it's really important for us to understand that, right? Because part of our role, all of our role collectively in this moment is to do that political education, to be able to tell that story, to be able to learn the lessons, both of the past and the present. And, you know, when we sit in East London, you know, we all have an even more and bigger responsibility, because often we talk about East London, you know, as the birthplace of both the labour movement, you know, with the trade unions and Keir Hardie, but it's also been the birthplace of the far right and of fascism, right, of the Dockers marching for Enoch Powell. It's been the place where the BNP won a council seat in Tower Hamlets. In Newham, that they won a third of all the seats, a third of the votes in the south of the borough. It's a story, of course, of 1978, you know, that as a community, you know, we've not been passive observers to this racism. You know, our struggle is an important part of the understanding of racism in this country. That in 1978, and I see some of the comrades who over those many years have changed Tower Hamlets, right? That it was us that took to the streets in Brick Lane to stop the far right. It was us who drove out the British National Party, who used to sell its newspapers at the top of Brick Lane all throughout the 80s and into the 90s. It was our communities that were united together that, you know, responded to the murder of Altab Ali, one in a long line of racist murders. But, you know, those murders didn't simply stop there. The response of our own community and how we organised after the brutal attacks, for example, against Mukhtar Ahmed and Qudus Ali, and the response of young people coming together, and subsequently the criminalisation of their protests through the Tower Hamlets 9 campaign, that are all important parts of our responsibility to be able to tell the real story of racism in Britain, and to pay tribute also to, you know, to the many different icons. And I'm always struck, you know, that of course at this moment of intense interest around Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of icons that we look to. So we all now say, if you look on social media, we must read Malcolm X, we must read Angela Davis, we must read Assata Shakur, we must read all of these, and they are all important people to read. But it's also important that we remember the work, for example, that in our own communities that the Bangladeshi workers did, that we talk about Maya Sen and the UK Black Panthers. We talk about the community organisations that we created is a response to racism and police violence on the streets, from Kappa in Tower Hamlets to New Monitoring Project. This is our history, and it's really important that it's front and center of the story that we tell, because it's not simply about the past. I would say we're a moment of unfinished business, right? So of course, walking through Tower Hamlets now, or walking through Newham now, is a very, very different experience than it was when we walked through in the 80s and 90s. Absolutely, we have changed East London profoundly for that. But that doesn't mean that racism in itself has been ever eradicated. And it's important to look back at those moments, because those struggles of our community around racism were not simply about trying to take on the far right. And as important as that is, it was not simply about stopping the racist violence. And as important that is, we were always talking about the racism within, embedded in our institutions. You know, the first campaigns that many of our communities took were about racism in the education system, the disproportionate failure of, and the disproportionate number of young Black people, and I also speak as Black as being a unifying term of all people of colour who experience racism. And I absolutely, we must respect all of our identities, but we do have a common experience that brings us together. You know, the first campaigns, Tower Hamlets, notorious for what? What were some of the biggest campaigns? They were around housing, whether that was back in the squatters movement or it was Tower Hamlets' infamous racist sons and daughters policy. It's been a central part of our fight. Has things changed? Of course, things have moved on. Have we ensured that we as a community don't live in the poorest housing, in the worst social and economic conditions? Of course not. We only need to look at where our community is situated. We can look at it from an issue about health and social inequalities that, of course, have been exposed by Corona pandemic, that are are decades in the making. They're about where we are situated in terms of the heavy industries, the air pollution, where we are situated in the labour market, where we're situated without social and economic protection, where we're forced back into work, as Zita said. I think one of the things, for example, that Corona did is show that there is actually a Corona apartheid, right? Because one part of our society was able to have the tools at hand to be able to protect themselves. Why? Because of their economic position in either the kind of work that they were doing, the kind of accommodation that they were living, people who had gardens, people who had, were living in overcrowded housing. For much of our community that was living in multi-generational, overcrowded housing with no green space, were working in low pay, for them, there was never a lockdown. There was an experience of poverty, of inequality, of a lack of food and housing. And we know that, again, has been decades in the making, but supercharged by a decade of austerity and austerity cuts. But I want to also just talk, again, briefly thinking about, from New Monitoring Project, when we think about the campaigns that we ran about Newham 7 and Newham 8, the self-defense campaigns, the campaigns around racist policing and deaths in custody, and where we are at this moment now. Because, I think we're at a crossroads again. So there is some people who want to, I think, repeat what happened in the 1980s, when we as a community were out on the streets demanding change. What we were told was, well, the answer is, it's all about abstract diversity. It's all about simply representation, or it's all around this notion of multiculturalism, that we should all just simply understand each other's culture, and that would be a step forward. And of course, we do need to do that. And we're in this weird position of having to defend multiculturalism against the attack of the right. But that was never our core demand. Our core demand was creating an anti-racist society in Britain, making Britain positively anti-racist. And to be able to do that, that meant we had to focus on institutional racism. And when I think of that seminal moment that we had, where many of us were campaigning around the Stephen Lawrence murder, and again, his murder was just one in the long line of murders, right? We were averaging 10 racist murders a year during that period. Was the Macpherson inquiry, and it talked about institutional racism. And whilst it was a huge victory that much of what we've said about institutional racism was officially recognised, actually nothing was ever put in place to actually tackle those structural inequalities or institutional. People looked at it as simply being about, about the policing, about police, but didn't look at it in terms of across all of our sectors and the institutions of power. And racism has, of course, always been fundamentally a question of power. So for us, I think there are two challenges. One is, what does it mean for us as Black people, or as Black BAME or minority communities, to organise in this moment and to build our power, whether that's internally in the Labour Party, and as a person also a member of the Labour Party, to ensure that the Labour Party moving forward actually is actively an anti-racist party. And what does that mean? And how do we ensure that the Labour Party's policies and responses, whether it's to the COVID crisis or to the oncoming recession that we're going to see, right? That recession we're now talking about, will be probably akin to the 1980s. And those of us who lived through the 1980s will tell you that of the people who will be most impacted, it will be our communities that will face the biggest impact in terms of income. They'll face the biggest impact in terms of the precariousness of our work, of the cuts that will happen to the very necessary social services.
Sorry, Asad, sorry to interrupt. You've got a minute to wrap up, please, yeah?
Okay, I'm going to finish then. I'm going to finish, sorry. So I think it's important for us to bring that as perspective, what I would call a race, class, gender perspective into the Labour Party. I think it's also important that we We are the people who, even in the 70s and 80s, never understood about the fight against racism being just about the UK. We were internationalists. That's why we stood with Palestine and we stood with South Africa. Why today we have to talk about internationalism when we talk about from climate to the impacts of corona globally. I see many of us are here from, you know, the Indian subcontinent, and of course, Tamils, many from the Bangladeshi community. We're talking about 50% of all workers in the global south being left without work. Here, whilst we talked about nature is recovering, people in Bangladesh working in the garment industry were left destitute. It's our companies, it's our multinationals, it's our City of London, it's our banks, many of those situated in Tower Hamlets, that are responsible for many of those inequalities. So our response has also got to be an internationalist response in terms of our own racism. And I want to just say one final thing. We know also in this moment, you know, the far right are reorganizing. They've got a politics of walls and fences. And, you know, we saw a couple of weeks ago that they flew the White Lives Matter over the Burnley football, Burnley and Manchester City. And I think for many of us, that we drew an immediate parallel with the BNP's Rights for Whites campaign that they ran in Tarmlets. And I think the idea that simply everybody in this country is on our side, absolutely is not true, right? So they're also organizing, and we have a responsibility to take on both immigration, to take on the decades of Islamophobia that came from the war on terror, that are in the prevent schemes, that have institutionalized racism within our judicial system, which means we're disproportionately in the prison system. It means about taking on the stop and searches which criminalize young people. It means about reinvesting and investing. What does defunding the police in the US mean here? It means rebuilding our youth services. It means building and investing in our community so that people in our community have the chance of a life chance that is beyond working in precarious and low-paid work. Thank you. Sorry for running over, Rahul Bhai. Rahul Bhai, I think you're muted.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thanks for your nice speech, Asad Bhai. Like Zita, if you can bear with us, okay. I'm sure a lot of the participants will have questions for you. Can I now move on to our MP, Afsana Begum, and if I can ask her to say a few words. Afsana, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening and Assalamu alaikum. I just want to start off by saying thank you to the BAME Forum, in particular the chair and the secretary, for organising and putting together this event, which is crucial and important and reaches us not in terms of a moment, but in terms of a movement that has accumulated many grievances, many issues that have been going on, you know, not just decades, but centuries. And we all have stories to tell in terms of ourselves and our own experiences locally, nationally, and internationally, in terms of the experiences of racism. So I want to sort of start by saying, you know, I have been working for a few months now since being elected in Parliament, you know, campaigning on this, writing articles on racism, but I do want to spend my allotted time talking about the issues at hand, rather than sort of listing everything I've done. But of course, everybody that has joined the call can, of course, go to my website, go to my social media channels to obtain more information about my activities and actions in this area. And before I continue, also good to see Asad again, and also to listen and hear from Zita as well on the crucial work that they've been doing decade upon decade on these areas. I mean, you know, I wanted to firstly talk about the latest Public Health England report, disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on certain groups, because recognized and confirmed that factors such as racism and social inequalities may have contributed to the increased risk of BAME communities catching and dying from the virus. And upon reading that report, I just thought to myself, well, it's been clear to really anybody who really wanted to know. You know, if you really wanted to know for some time now, you would know that this is all symbolic and all shows the systemic economic inequality that mean that ethnic minorities are obviously at higher risk of being in poverty, and so particularly disadvantaged by the health crisis we have endured. Now, it's been obviously now a few weeks now since the part censored review that was reluctantly commissioned by the government. And that it also shows, of course, the alarming statistic that Bangladeshi people face around twice the risk of death. And I understand and I recognize that there is much anxiety and much concern, quite rightly so, as to why it's taken months for this to be recognized, and so many of us knew this, and also the fact that we still are going ahead with decisions and policies, that without it really clearly being examined transparently as to how policies and decisions will affect particular groups, and without confirmation that the situation for BAME people will not be made worse. And we talk about this right now, like we're talking about today, we're talking about yesterday, we're talking about this is still happening, people are still dying right now. We know this, what is actually happening, why are decisions being made without all of these findings and confirmations being taken into account. Locally, I did want to sort of mention, it is really disturbing for me that 4,000 workers at the local council are being sacked and having worse contracts being imposed on them under the proposed Tower Reward scheme, because again, this is further evidence that these contracts and these terms and conditions will obviously further disproportionately impact on Black and minority ethnic communities and also women. And it's particularly, I'd say, particularly concerning that a proper meaningful equality impact assessment has not been produced. We know the salary bands and the workers that this Tower Reward scheme is going to affect. It is those that are on the lower pay bands in the council, and we know that's made up of local people, BAME people and women. So I really think joined up and holistic thinking with genuine action to go along with the gestures are now vital to literally save further lives. And as has been mentioned, I'm not going to speak too much to repeat what others have said, but of course structural racism needs to be addressed, and we need answers as to why BAME people are always forced to get the smallest slice of the cake, as it were, and why is it that services for us are the first to be cut, and why is it our lives right now are not being protected? And I really, I refuse to accept this injustice, and I'm sick and tired of looking around me and seeing how hard, the hard work, the creativity and the generosity of local people in Poplar Lime has lived their lives, and so often goes unrewarded. Our area, of course, our constituency, of course, is one of the most diverse areas in the country, with a large Bangladeshi population, a Somali population as well. It is one of the most deprived. We all know about the highest child poverty rate here, but it's now us having suffering a high percentage of excess deaths due to COVID-19. I also wanted to, I guess, touch upon in terms of the Bangladeshi community in particular. The data from the annual population survey in 2018, which talks about the Bangladeshi workers being disproportionately employed in distribution, hotels and restaurants, as well as transport and communication, and that's also representative in terms of the number of excess deaths. So all of these things need to be looked at, but I think we've had things passed in Parliament, legislation passed, such as we had a statutory instrument relating to health regulations, and a full impact assessment hasn't been undertaken, despite knowing these facts, despite knowing the fact that we've got all of these disproportionalities. We know, so we've got these unfair pay gaps, we've got the lower incomes that many workers from ethnic minority backgrounds face. We know the fact that households with low income are more likely to be overcrowded and have damp problems. And I spoke recently in the last week about how relevant it is to speak about things like the connection between COVID-19 and damp conditions and chronic exposure to damp conditions, because of course COVID-19 attacks the respiratory system. So we need to talk more about these things, and we need to explore how ethnic minority lives can be protected as a result. There's many other things. I'm conscious of time, but I will just cover a few more things. One of which is, it's been 3 years since the Grenfell tragedy. And that was a tragedy, but it was a catastrophe in terms of how it exposed how little Black Lives Matter to the British establishment. There are still 300 high-rise residential and publicly owned buildings with unsafe cladding, including here in Tower Hamlets. The Westbury generic debacle is further evidence of how the government is more interested in serving the billionaires rather than the interests of local people in Poplar and Limehouse. And alongside calling for justice, we need to ensure, for example, that the Westbury site is used for the benefit of local people, including local BAME people. Just a little bit more in terms of climate justice. I mean, so I mentioned in terms of respiratory conditions, and according to campaigners, we've got about 40% of the population in the borough as a whole, Tower Hamlets, living in unacceptable air quality. And we know our children are literally growing up with reduced lung capacity due to NO2 exposure, and so they're at greater risk anyway of developing lifelong breathing disorders. And again, that just shows, these are the symptoms that affect an individual's vulnerability to COVID-19 anyway. And I think we also, quite rightly need to actually consider the wider issues of privatisation and underfunding, that has, undermined, I guess, the daily efforts of our health workers, and our health workers are doing, delivering, working, but actually until we address those systematic issues around privatisation and underfunding as well, we will still keep having BAME people experiencing poorer, having poorer access to services, but also poorer quality of services as well. Before I finish, I just want to also say that I have been too moved and inspired by the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement is growing, and I really will continue to keep working to raise the plight of local Black and ethnic minority communities in government. I think as ethnic minority people from our own communities, we need to show solidarity and stand shoulder to shoulder with others from other ethnic minority backgrounds. If I'm Bangladeshi, I need to stand in solidarity with the Somali community and vice versa. So we need to stand together on these issues together. I also just wanted to mention, there's been a lot of activity in terms of protests, in terms of statues, and I think we do also have to think about state violence, and a lot of us have been talking about racism, Islamophobia and discrimination, and unfortunately we've got the government having its counter-terrorism and security bill receive its second reading even in just the last week, and this is legislation that not only just delays the long-awaited review of PREVENT, which of course discriminates against Muslims and introduce significant curtailments on civil liberties, but it will of course considerably disadvantage Black and ethnic minority communities. And on just really one final point, which I have made previously, but I just want to emphasize, I really think from now on, every decision by government or any other public authority needs to consider and really act on addressing the needs of Black and ethnic minority communities. I feel a great weight of responsibility on my shoulders at this moment in time because of the figures and because of these alarming statistics. It's something of such importance and magnitude that I will, as a matter of conscience, continue to speak out on as plainly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Afsana, for your nice speech. So, like the other can bear with us. I'm sure participants will have questions for you. I would like to. I think the chair. I think the chair wants to say something. Chair, would you?
Thank you, guests. I could see so many comrades has arrived. I did not personally say hello to them, but nevertheless, to very known faces. What happens after these guest speakers have spoken? I believe that everybody who have joined in will have something to say. So to save everyone time, we reckon that if other people just have 2 minutes and just have your say, and what happens, we can recommend more people, then you can ask questions to the guest speakers, or if you got any other issues. So I believe that one after another will be asked to speak. So if you consider your time, please, you are allowing another person who can speak. And there is another non-BAME friend, comrade. I believe that she should be given to say something, and then we shall come general to other people. Yeah, which is Anne. Yeah, Anne, can you listen?
Hello.
Yeah.
I'm just listening. I think it's been a fantastic lineup. Thank you so much. I think it would be inappropriate for me to put my oar in at this time. But yeah, it's been fascinating. And I suppose the only question I would have is, I was pretty horrified really by Keir Starmer's comments on the Black Lives Matter movement. I thought it was tone deaf, disrespectful, and really, a look that's on the wrong side of history. And I wonder if, comrades from the BAME Forum could suggest how can we deal with this in the party in a constructive way? What's the best way for us to respond to those comments, which I thought were pretty disgraceful? But thank you so much to the BAME Forum. Thanks, Sundar and Rahul, for putting together such a great lineup. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. What happened? Okay, hello.
We can hear you, Uncle, now. We can hear you.
All right, thank you very much. What happens, our executive mayor, John Biggs, he's trying with that link, he could not gain the access. So I feel in certain way that as BAME community, where I stand and which bar I am living, you could imagine, I'm not saying nothing, but nobody would stop me saying something. Because if the executive mayor cannot access that link, it means he needs a lot of training. I know the fellow has gone too old. However, I don't feel shame to say such a thing. People know me pretty well. However, we need to continue with this particular campaign, whether BAME community is always affected by coronavirus, by budget cuts, by hostility of any forces. We could imagine that what ground we are standing. So I would like to thank all of you to zoom into that meeting tonight, and please have your say. And I would request all the guests there that if anyone wishes to ask any questions or generally they want to say something, they are most welcome. So I leave it with Ruhul. He will continue with other guests. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So if I can ask the former council leader, Jalaluddin Abbas, to say a few words, please. Abbas, are you here?
Can you hear me, Ruhul?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, can I thank our chair and the secretary for organizing and reactivating BAME from entire hamlets. I'm not going to be global. I'm not going to be laughing and puffing and try to solve the problem in the whole world. I want to talk about local issues and local solutions. I've lived through racism in all my life. I've been part and parcel of some of the campaigns, a number of other comrades. And one of the things I've seen
I'm sorry to interrupt, Sasa. Can I just request Rulebike, if you ask everyone to mute themselves, then we'll be able to hear from the speaker. I think there are some participants who's not muted themselves. It's important. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Yes, I think somebody has their mic on, so whoever that is, I'm trying to see who it is. If they can mute their mics, please. Abbas, but you may continue.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think what I was trying to actually say is that, is that we need to be pragmatic, we need to be realistic. We're not going to change the whole racist world together, just at one stroke. But what unfortunate racist death of George Floyd has done is created a movement of people of all colors and backgrounds justice. And one example of that is, I think, what we've seen in Tehran is a total failure of leadership from the Labour Party, a party that I belong to, and sometimes I feel embarrassed belonging to a party that does nothing but huffs and puffs and just creates opportunities for debate and discussions, and it fizzles away. One concrete example of that is Councillor Ethersham's steps to remove this racist statue and the work that he and some of his colleagues are undertaking to change the name of Sir John Kerr schools. I think we need to look at what practical things we can actually do, what practical things we can achieve. As I've said earlier, Chair and Secretary and comrades, the racism of the streets have now become licensed and institutionalized. What we have actually seen every time, and most unfortunate incidentally happens, every time Black people take to the street, the classical solution that white supremacists come up with, let's have another investigations, let's have another study, let's have another research. If anything, Black community, whichever sections and segment of the Black community you look at, have been over-researched. The needs of the Black community is abundantly clear. Comrade Assad, I think, talked a lot and gave a quite detailed history of various impact our community have and challenges we've been facing over the years, whether it's poor unemployment, poor health, poor housing, and more recently, the impact of COVID-19. What we have actually seen is a lot of policy statements. What we have not seen in places like Tehran, which has a high percentage of Bangladeshis and Somalians who have been disproportionately been impacted. I lose someone that I know in Tehran every other day. I have not heard that from any of my non-BAME comrades in any part of London. And that is heartening. That is families losing members, friends. We have not seen a single practical step of how to address that. We have not seen the leadership of Tehran in this case, and I have to name you, Mr. Mayor Biggs, to have taken a practical step and acknowledge that we are facing a unique situation in Tehran. We need unique solutions. The needs of our communities are well known in terms of poor health, in terms of inaccessible services, the health service providers in Tehran. I have not seen anything. What we have actually seen is a total failure. What we've seen is token gestures of people simply putting on Black Lives Matter t-shirts on. Well, is that the contribution that we expect from our leadership? Is that the kind of contribution we want from the Labour Party? Certainly not. I think if anything, the time has come. We achieved things in the early 80s and late 70s through demand and through actions. What we actually want to see is practical solution to many of the problems. They are well known to the local authority. If anyone doesn't know it, I'm happy to spend time with them. If anyone doesn't know what are the needs of the Somali community, I'm sure there are comrades in the Somali community that can provide them with those kind of issues. What we don't need is another study, another research, and what that actually means, let's kick things into the long grass so we can just let these people make a lot of noises, because at the end of the day, they think we will go home and forget about it. I tell you, comrades, we will not go home and forget about it. We have been here, we will be here, and we'll continue to be here. And if it actually means to expose the kind of institutional racism that operates within this borough, within our party, then let's take a stance.
Thank you, Abbas Bhai. Very beautifully said. If I can go on to Christine Shawcroft, the former NEC member of the Labour Party, if I can ask her to say a few words. Christine, are you here? Christine? Okay, I think she's...
Well, but I don't think Christine has is part of the Zoom meeting. I can't see her name.
No, she did actually log in. Okay, in that case, I'll move on to Councillor Ehtesham Haq. Brother Ehtesham, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rubai. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I mean, I feel very, very small given that I'm in presence of many legends here who fought in 80s and in 70s in their anti-racism movement and gave us or brought us where we are today, including Shundo Mama, Halaluddin Abbas Uncle, and others. I don't want to go into long history and look into the broader narratives and everything that we need to know about how racism is manifested in our society and in every arena, because there has been commission research, there has been reports, and we know what the problems are. So I will just be very short and focus on something that I am inspired by, something that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, that do what you can with what you have where you are. So in practicing that teaching, what I will say to many comrades is, let us just focus on what's in front of us. If we cannot change probably what Boris Johnson will be passing, what legislation will be passing, and many other things, but we can focus into our hamlets. And that's why one of my action was to actually do the petition and bring down Robert Milligan's statue. Now that was just a symbolic thing. That does not mean actually the problem's gone. What we have to probably recognize is how we are at times divided in these sort of moments, and how strategically these sort of movements are squashed, and they're experts and they have done it before, and we have to be aware of it. What we also have to recognize is when we, let's say within the party, we have faced racism from the left and from the right. It's not as if there is only one section within the party who has the moral monopoly in these issues. We have seen how many of the comrades have been treated by local entities which are supposed to be holding or upholding Jeremy Corbyn's values. You know about this, Rulbai, and many of the comrades knows. Now, what I will suggest is this.
Sorry, Ehtesham, I object to you using my name. Please don't use my name.
So sorry? No, I did not use anyone's name.
My name for political purposes or for standing on a soapbox. Thank you.
No, I'm not using anyone's name. What I'm saying, how we've been treated. So I think you should not interrupt. I'm not taking anyone's name.
Well,
so I think
just take it up with your therapist.
It's probably glorious.
If you can wrap up within a minute, and please.
Yeah, I'll just finish in 1 minute.
I'll let you speak.
Probably,
please, let continue, and if you can wrap up within a minute, please.
Yeah, sure. So it's probably glamorous or sexy to stand up and talk about racism when it fits our bill, as we have seen many comrades before. But we should have stood that time probably, even when we faced racism within the local entities when Jeremy Corbyn was in power. I do not condone, and I obviously express the frustration how Keir Starmer has labeled this as a moment. It's definitely not acceptable. But I will suggest this to the chair of BAME Forum and to Secretary Ruholbai and to many other comrades I may disagree with and may have fallen out before. But this is the time where it demands our unity. It demands, no matter whatever happened in the past, no matter whatever differences that we had, it's time for us to come out and really bring about some meaningful changes. And we can only get it through demanding. I'm sorry, at times probably just constructive emails and petitions will not work. If it requires, we have to go and stand outside buildings, outside institutions, and point out to their racism and the systemic racism that exists there. And I would expect every comrade to please forget about the past. These are the time when your brothers are being killed and when you know how people are suffering. So let us rise, above our ego, above our differences, and bring about some meaningful changes. That will be my plea to all my brothers and sisters here. Thank you, Rulbai, for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Rulbai. Right, can I now, I can see Rulbai is actually waving. So he's been waiting for some time. So if I can go into Councillor Purumia.
Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for the BAME Forum for having arranging this amazing event. But I just want to thank our guests as well, Asad Bhai and Sister Zita. Your legends, your work it has spoken for yourself, and we do share a mutual friend who's a legend in himself within the party, and it's a testament to your comradeship, his work. But I just want to, I wasn't gonna speak on this. Elena was gonna raise the issue about the work we were doing with the migrant undocumented workers locally, and we were providing food with the BME Forum. And we're also working on a manifesto for migrant rights, working with the Migrant Rights Network and the Institute of Race Relations. So it's something that I'll forward to the BAME Forum to be distributed, and we'd like everyone's input into that. What we're planning to do is practically is have tribunals locally based on the People's Tribunal, just to get testimony from people about how migrants, people with no recourse to public funds, are more or less second-class citizens and are discriminated against by our racist immigration laws. But my question to Zita and Asad is, I'd like you to hold our feet to the fire. And I'd like you to basically, what practical steps can we as members of the Labour Party, as public office holders, both locally and nationally, do to dismantle these systems of control, which in fact racism is? It's a system of control. It's not bad behavior. What can we practically do to basically dismantle those systems of control which divides communities and oppresses them? So I'd like your suggestions for us to.
Thank you,
Do you want us to respond now?
If you can actually just keep hold of those questions, Zita and Asad, you can answer them. I can see a few people waving, so I'm going to go on to the people who want to speak, and then you can maybe answer the questions at the end. So I can see Jakir Hussain waving. He's the Popular Online CLP fundraising officer.
Yeah, sorry, I might take just 2 minutes if that's okay with you, Ruhul Bhai.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, so first of all, I would just like to thank the speakers. I have really found your speeches enlightening and have learned things that I did not know before. So thank you all. Before I ask my question, I would like to give a brief background to my question so that the question is responded to accordingly. Is there not time, do you think, that education about the British Empire and its colonial history be made mandatory in schools to tackle racism, inequality, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination? If the public and our new generation understood why the migration to European countries took place, in particular the UK, there would be a greater appreciation for migrants and not disdain. As many of us are aware or will be aware, relationship education will be taught to schools from September, which is now mandatory. The purpose of introducing relationship education, as I understand it, is to educate children to understand the different types of relationships that exist in our society, and therefore to be tolerant of differences and diversity. Should we not equally, and I stress the word equally, in the name of tolerance, diversity, and understanding, should we not teach school children from a young age about the British colonial past and how the wealth extracted from the colonized nations, which in today's money, as Asad mentioned earlier, 45 trillion was alone extracted from the Indian subcontinent, which was used to enrich Britain. And therefore, I believe that we can mold our children to understand that we all, regardless of our color, backgrounds, have an equal stake in the future of Britain, because all of our monies were used to enrich Britain and develop Britain. The impoverishment of Africa and India and other colonized countries fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Britain's advancement was at the expense of others' miseries, unfortunately. So my question is, I would like to know what steps both our mayor, I know he's not here, or his deputy, and Apsana Begum, what steps can you take, or what wheels can you set in motion to make this education about Britain's colonial history mandatory for all schools in the very imminent future, given the current situation we find ourselves in. And I had another question, if I'm allowed, Rahul Bhai.
Okay, then go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. The other one is very quickly. Apsana, you mentioned about the deprivation in Thai hamlets. One would think that we are blessed with having Canary Wharf within Thai hamlets, yet the average person in Thai hamlets does not benefit from Canary Wharf other than to inhale the car fumes coming out from the Porsches and Ferraris of the workers who are working in Canary Wharf and earning six figures. What would you do to make sure that the wealth created by Canary Wharf is fairly distributed all around Thai hamlets? The question is also to the mayor or his deputy if they are present. Thank you.
Thank you, Zakir Bhai. Right, can I, so if you can write down the questions, Apsana and Zita. If I can move on to Sabina Khan, who is the membership vice chair, membership secretary for Poplar and Limehouse. If I can ask her to say a few words. Sabina, are you here?
Oh, hi, assalamu alaikum. I wasn't planning on asking a question, but I would just ask Asad and Zita. We were debating with my daughter yesterday regarding Churchill's statue, and we were playing good cop, bad cop. She being a young person, she was saying we should take it down, and because he represents empire. And I was saying that he was elected as a prime minister. He was a wartime prime minister. So do we have he's got his status in the history? So how do we create a narrative that it's acceptable for right, left, everyone? Number one. And number two is I found what happened in Thai Hamlet is awful and really got me agitated and upset. During this whole coronavirus, we just got smoke and screen mirror from the mayor and the council, just removing the statue. I mean, for me, I believe in outcomes in terms of what Helal Abbas uncle said it's about poverty, it's about overcrowded housing, it's about health, it's about environment, it's about crime. It's those kind of things affects us to have social mobility and to have better prospect of health. And none of those single KPI have been said or spoken. So how do we build a campaign? If anyone can enlighten us regarding that, because I'm not happy with this whole smoke and mirror of taking some statues off. I just feel like I have been mocked by doing it. Thank you.
Sabina, thank you. So if anybody else wants to ask any questions, please raise your hand, either physically or on the system, so I can see. Can I quickly ask our CLP, Community Liaison Officer, Mohammed Abdul Shukur, to say a few words. Shukur bhai, can you hear me? Shukur bhai. Hello. Okay. So if anybody wants to speak, just raise your hands, please. So I'm going to actually go to Zita now, and maybe Zita can answer some of the questions. Yeah.
Okay, so starting with the first question about practical steps that can be taken to dismantle systems, I think the key to that is organize, 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 but it also involves mobilizing. So in order to organize, you need to mobilize to have the right people involved and to consult people, engage people, and make sure they have a stake in what happens. So that's crucial. If we're going to be successful in dismantling systemic racist systems, then we can't be divided and ruled. And that's why organising and mobilising is so important, that we need to bring everybody together who has a stake in this and who it's a concern for. And we need to involve them. It's going back to what I was saying at the beginning, that we can't have corporate organisations and institutions making decisions and deciding to do things without consulting the community. Interestingly, when that statue came down in Tower Hamlets, some people said to me, you know, why weren't there any black people there when it came down to, you know, say something or give a speech or whatever? And I have no issue with it going down. But I think it would have been good to have somebody who, you know, who is living with the legacies of what that man did, to say something about it as well. So I think, yeah, we have to work together. We can't allow ourselves to be divided and run. There's more that connects us and brings us together, more commonality around what we face than, you know, should divide us. But we also need to reach out, because there will be parts of our communities who don't get engaged in campaigning and the politics of what's going on in the borough. So we have to find ways of reaching them and engaging with them and hearing their voices, and making sure that they have a say in what's happened, what's happening. On the question about education, well, I've been involved in several campaigns to ensure that there's Black history on the curriculum. I've been doing this for a long time as a school governor, but also I was part of a very small but successful campaign group that led to Michael Gove, when he was the education minister, having to do a U-turn, and that was the Mary Seacole curriculum campaign. And the government wanted to remove the very, very few Black historical figures that were taught on the history curriculum, and that included Mary Seacole and Oluda Equiano from the curriculum. So I think, yes, teaching the history of colonialism and enslavement in schools is important. But what I also think is really important is to teach our histories before colonialism, before enslavement, through that, in spite of that, and all of our achievements. Because I don't think that the only thing that should be taught about us is from a perspective of oppression. Yeah, and we come from ancient historic empires, you know, where we built amazing things, we've achieved amazing things, we've created empires. And when my son was growing up, and actually, you know, even before that, when I was at school, art schools were trying to teach that we began with, Black people began with enslavement, you know, that we had no history before, like we didn't form ancient empires, Benin empires, you know, Nubians, Egyptians, etc. And the same applies for all of us, wherever we come from, the African and Asian diasporas. We have rich histories and rich achievements. So all of that history needs to be taught. And yes, it's not necessarily British history, but what happened before is important, and what's happened since is important. I remember my son going to school, and he had a book about the transatlantic slave trade, the book I bought him, that he brought into school for some project they were doing in school. And children were laughing at a picture of the slave ship, and saying that's what happened to your grandparents, ha 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 ha. And all hell broke out when that happened to my son in the school, and the teachers didn't properly challenge that. And one of the reasons why I became a governor is to make sure that I had a say in the school. So I will link governor for various subjects, but one of them was history. All of those, you know, on boards and on committees and in school governing bodies and on committees for universities, because we need voices to be there, because when we're not there, then these kind of things happen. So I think, yes, we do need to have that history that you talked about, but we need a lot more in terms of history. And actually, we need the books. What was the final question that was asked? Can somebody remind me of the last question? It was about how we create a narrative, is that correct? Yeah? No?
Yes, yes.
I'm trying to remember what the last one was. I had a note of it. Maybe somebody else will pick that up and I can come back to it.
Yeah.
I think
Narrative.
it was about statues and
Zeta. Narrative.
Okay. So, well, I actually think that the conversation about the statues is important, yeah, because those symbols of oppression are actually painful and hurtful to see, because effectively those people are being put on pedestals, and there is the problem with them is there's no narrative, is there, about what they did, how they did it. They're just there. Tourists come from all over, and there's no education. There's no plaque up there explaining the horrendous things they did. So if anything, I think that if they're going to, they either should be parked somewhere in a warehouse at the back of a cupboard and never be seen again. But the issue about Churchill, actually, perhaps it'd be better off in a museum, you know, where there can be some narrative about the different things he did, and why one lot of people are holding him up and elevating him here, and why he is a symbol of oppression for others. And then there can be some educational program and tools around the conversation that takes place, because he's in a museum where there are resources and where you can have that balanced discussion about him, rather than being in a prestigious place in the middle of Parliament Square where there's no narrative around what he's achieved. But yes, of course, the crucial thing is to dismantle those systems of oppression and institutional racism and systemic racism. But this is one of the things I've been saying to the Cabinet Office over the last couple of weeks. They're serious about getting rid of institutional racism. Part of the reason why institutional racism is thriving and existing and allowed to continue is those legacies of colonialism and enslavement. So actually, they need to get rid of several things. They need to get rid of the symbols, but they also need to get rid of the practices and processes that have been there through history that endorse those thoughts and ideas. So I think the historic stuff has to be done alongside the practical things of changing processes and systems. And some of the processes and systems are current new ones, but most of them are embedded in those historical legacies. Even the language that's used in legislation, you know, is discriminatory on gender grounds. So legislation, when it's written, is written as he, yeah, because it's been there since the beginning of time. So it only refers to men, it doesn't refer to women. So there's so many things like that that need to be changed, because we live in a patriarchal society, as well as, you know, a racist society. But we need to work together. I mean, the answer to all of that is that we need to have dialogue like this.
Sorry to interrupt you.
We need to stand together, to organize very well together. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I understand that I have seen Shukurbai have raised his hand, and a couple of other people. However, I would always respect our opponent, our comrade. Mike Davis came in earlier, he zoomed in, and I would ask him to share his feelings and thoughts, and what he has to say about all these guests have spoken out, and so many people ask questions. I reckon that Mike, you were listening. So nice to have you back. would you like to say anything?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, some really important contributions. I was out for about 15 minutes, so I don't know I picked up all the kind of questions that people asked. But this is a very significant time in terms of a raising of awareness of the possibility of change happening. I was in a previous life a teacher, and just connecting to some of the last points Zita was making, I think one of the key areas that we need to change is what's happening in schools. Back in the 70s and 80s, before Mrs. Thatcher abolished the Inner London Education Authority, London schools had a multicultural inspectorate and were actually encouraged to teach about history with varying cultural perspectives, including Black history. And for me, if you're talking about British history, you're talking about Black history, you're talking about Asian history, you're talking about what Britain has done around the world and the consequences of that. We used to use a textbook called The People Who Came. And the resource library in the school I taught for many years was stacked with books by people like the poet Braithwaite, Edward Braithwaite, Achebe, some of the African writers, Nthogo, John Asgard, Linton Kwesi Johnson. And the children were actually also encouraged to talk about their own experiences, as many of them were migrant or second or third generation children from various backgrounds. And they were encouraged to draw on their own experiences and share that. And that way we actually created, I think, a culture within the school. And it wasn't just the school I taught in, it was a number of schools across London that was respectful and understood the history in a real sense. And it wasn't just in history lessons, it happened in English, it would happen in other subject areas. We've lost that with the national curriculum, and with Michael Gove in year 2010, you know, we've had a whitewash of the school curriculum. All that kind of important multicultural history. For most schools, some have managed to hold on to it, but for many, many, it's gone. And we need to reconnect with that and reintroduce that into the school curriculum. So for me, that's one important area of change that we need to refocus on over the next period. Because if we can change the consciousness and the awareness of young people, then I think we've changed the awareness of the upcoming generation. And we have suffered huge setbacks under the last 10 years of Tory government. The other thing I would say, and I'm sure people talked about it, is the hostile environment, which does actually predate the Tories, but not by very much. People talked about the immigration mugs of Mr. Miliband. We need to challenge at every turn this environment, because as we saw with the Windrush scandal, and we've seen the treatment of other ethnic communities like the BAME community with COVID-19, disproportionate, as Zita said and others have said, disproportionate effect on those communities. This is all a result of the hostile environment and the ways in which migrant communities pushed down into a second, third-rate position in society. So that, for me, is another really big challenge and something we should do. But I want to just finally thank the BAME Forum for organising this event. It's been incredibly valuable, and I hope we can share the ideas more widely. Although, you know, we've got a sort of relatively good number of people. Obviously, there's a huge number of members that aren't participating. We need to get the ideas and this discussion generated to a wider number of people and beyond. But yeah, just congratulations to the BAME Forum for organising. The speakers coming along.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate your feedback. If I can ask Abdul Shukur Bhai, our CLP community liaison officer, to say a few words. Shukur Bhai.
Hello.
Are you there? Yes.
Do you hear me?
Say something.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. I would like to thank you, the BME chair, Junaid Ahmed Sundar, and BME secretary, Ruhul Amin, because they arranged a nice Zoom meeting for us. I'd like to say few words about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is considered the greatest Briton of the 20th century and outright racist, is admired by a significant section of the British public. He is a hero to many, and we know when a person is seen as a hero, the hero worshipper imbibe the words and action of their hero wholeheartedly, and there is in their minds no rooms for fault or shortcomings in their hero. So, Churchill racist views are subconsciously planted in their minds of the hero worshippers, and that is the problem. Churchill was responsible for the murder of 3 million people in Bengal during the Bengal famine in 1943 due to his deliberate policy of diverting the food supplies heading for Bengal, which was diverted to Greece to be stored as a stockpile reserved for the army. So I would like to know the guest speaker, Assad, and the MP's views on Churchill. Thank you.
Thank you, Shukrubhai, for your input and your question. They will answer your questions. So I can see a few people are waving their hands. Can I quickly go to Anwar Khan? Anwar, are you there? He's a community activist. Anwar? Mute. Anwar, can you hear me? Anwar, can you hear me?
Your mic is mute, Anwar. Unmute it. Unmute it.
I can unmute. I can
Okay.
Anwar, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, hello?
Yeah. So,
Can you hear me?
So you wanted to say something. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, CLP chairman, Sundar Bhai, and Ruhul Amin Bhai, who also arranged that program, very nice program, and a very nice evening also. I meet on to Apsara Begum MP, and congratulations to attend our program, and Asad Rahman, who is a leader also that, and my views to, I just asked you the question, like I as a member of the Labour Party for a long time, and I work for Labour Party for a long time, age of 15, I work for, go to for door to door. How many, like, I don't want to like racism. I see like a lot of Tower Hamlet racism can start, like we can see that a lot of knife crime, and Altabali also died for a long time ago, 1970. And how many, like, I can see the many, I'm as a young generation also, that how many I can see that like America, you know, the black ethnic minority is a racism they can start. And how many I can see like that, actually, that were my questions.
Okay, thank you, Anwar. So, okay, your question will be answered by the speakers. And who is it directed to? Who do you want to ask the question, Anwar? Who do you want to ask the question to?
Did you ask me, Ruhul Bhai, did you ask me that question?
Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you, Anwar. So can I go to Zakir Hussain? He's just waving. Zakir Bhai, are you there?
No, actually, maybe something coming up on your screen. I haven't put my hands up.
Oh, okay, that's fine then. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to say now.
Can I now go to Asad Rahman to answer some of the questions, please? Asad Bhai,
Sure.
Yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and some really great contributions. And first of all, total respect to Councillor Paramia for the work that he and others have been doing on supporting for members of our community, migrant, the undocumented, the most vulnerable. I think this has always been one of the toughest areas to ever work on in this country, is around migrant justice, and it's really, really important, the fight around recourse to public funds. But I wanted to just pick up on that point about the hostile environment, and to recognise the Labour Party and our collective responsibility in that as well, because often people talk about the hostile environment as being something that the Conservative Party has brought in, but of course this has been built on, you know, a decade of when the New Labour was in power, of triangulating to the right on asylum and migration, of responding to the right-wing media, of creating an issue where immigration was not one of the top issues at all in the public domain, in public consciousness. And then the campaigns that were run by the Daily Mail, the Sun, and how the political parties responded to that, reinforced that and made it into a public issue, so that it became the #1 issue. So how public narratives get created is really, really important, in the role and responsibility of politicians to reject that, both at a national and a local level. So we know that, you know, all of the asylum and immigration bills that came up, you know, you could say more immigration bills were passed by New Labour than on any other single issue. We know that the consequence of the war on terror reinforced the frame about Islamophobia and the anti-Muslim prejudice that we've seen, which brought and normalised racism again in its new form. I think we all accept that Islamophobia became the racism that was acceptable at the dinner table, in a way that other forms of racism haven't been for a long time. But the question about what do we need to do at the local level? Look, this is a time for real, genuine political leadership. And I think councils have to take that, and councillors have to take that. And there are many practical things. One of the things that have happened in local authorities is, you know, over the decades, we've stripped away what was once the community sector and made it into the voluntary sector, where we took away the campaigning element of community organisations, so their ability to be able to hold local authorities and councillors to account, and made everybody only into services. So we can try and put a plaster on what the issue is, but never actually help and reinforce and build the power of communities to actually address those issues. I think that is, if that is a policy decision that local authorities made, it can reverse that, and it can say, we are going to prioritize building what I would call community assets. We're going to build and reinforce and support grassroots and community organisations that just don't provide services, but actually are campaigning for institutional change, handing power back to communities. And I think there are lots of great examples of where that's been done, like Preston and others, that I think Tower Hamlets and people can look at in terms of doing that. I think going forward, we know that the challenge of COVID hasn't gone away. So all of the work that we've been doing about the disproportionate impacts onto the Black and minority communities is really critical. We know that the recession is going to do that. I think what we should be doing at local authority level is demanding that councils have an anti-racist embedded into their, how are they going to respond to these issues? And so that goes not simply as basically that anti-racism is a statement or a separate policy, but how is it connected and integrated into everything that the local authority does, and how does it give leadership to other institutions to ensure that, for example, the hospitals and the health service, you know, don't enable the hostile environment, don't begin to impose passport checks on people, because we know what that will mean. So I think it's part leadership, because you create a culture. And Tamlet should be an anti-racist community. It should be an anti-racist council. It should be an anti-racist borough, which says we expect everybody, all institutions in our borough, to be able to be actively standing up and not simply passive standing up. Zakir asked a question about education, and of course that's really, really important. I mean, the question about, you know, when I was a young person, we used to be saying, you know, we are here because you were there, and tried to tell the story of why we are in this country, right? It's because you explored.
Thank you, Asad.
Yeah, I'm just
Thank
going
you for.
to end with one final thing. Look, there are some really big decisions that happen, right? I remember when Canary Wharf was built, and people were told Canary Wharf would bring economic generation and jobs to the communities in Tower Hamlets. We were told the same in Stratford with Stratford City and Westfields, and we know that the economic regeneration policies enacted by local authorities disproportionately affect. There are countless studies which show that if you spend £10 at the top of Brick Lane, £9 leaves. If you spend £10 at the bottom of Brick Lane, £9 circulates in the community. That is ultimately council decisions. So it has to actually think about, you know, this regeneration is not about wealth trickling down. It's not about bringing rich people in. It's actually about building the wealth of our own community. On the Churchill statue, I'll just say one thing. Look, you know, the kicking over the statues has started a conversation. Many people didn't know about the things that we all know, that Britain spent 40% of its national budget on paying compensation to slave owners, and we only ended up paying that debt in 2015. But for me, it's not simply about bringing down the statues. It's actually about educating people about who these people are. So there are some that we celebrate that we shouldn't be celebrating, and there are others that we should be telling the real story of Churchill, about not just Bengal, about Kenya and Palestine and Kurds, and about in Tower Hamlets that he put armoured personnel carriers on tank on the streets in Tower Hamlets, in Sydney Street, you know. So there's a much bigger story that we need to be telling about. I'll just say one final thing. I think it's very telling about statues. There's a statue of celebrating and memorializing the animals that fought in the First and Second World War, sitting in Park Lane, massive. And that the statues for Indian and Caribbean soldiers, one is in Birmingham and one is in Brixton. And that was built overwhelmingly by donations by the local communities. That says a lot about how we sit in the history of Britain. So our story of colonialism isn't about simply in the past. It's actually about telling the story of us and how we built Britain as well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Asad. To start with, you are still looking young to my eyes. Nevertheless, I think part of the questions what Councillor Puru has asked, I think we shall go to our MP, Afsana Begum. Before that, we shall ask any of you wanted to ask any other questions, because it seems that our time is running out. Yeah. Now I understand that if we talk about British history, it would take a couple of months. But being residents of Tower Hamlet, if I look at my executive mayor, whole history, it glows on his appearance, Mr. John Biggs. You know, I don't feel shy to tell this. Nevertheless, we comrades, we need to get together. I would like to express my gratitude and thanks to all of the non-BAME who have participated to our BAME Forum's Zoom meeting. It is not the beginning. It is only started, and we should stick together and keep campaigning against anything, because I reckon that it would never end until the world is end. The racism will continue, and we need to firmly stay together. However, I would go to Afsana Begum, the MP of Poplar and Limehouse constituents. The question which I heard that already Asad Rahman have mentioned once, when the Canary Wolf was built, the dream was different. It was going to serve these poverty and people of Tower Hamlet Borough and all these. And I know that the constituency you belongs to, your constituency is more deprived. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Your constituency is more deprived than anywhere. Puru has asked that the money in Canary Wharf is floating everywhere. To balance that, what step would you be taken? If you would answer that question, I believe that you know what Puru has asked you earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And conscious of time, I'm not sure when this meeting finishes, but I myself will have to go at 9:30. I've noted a few of the questions. I'll start off by the question about Churchill. I mean, in my view, Churchill was a racist. He was an imperialist. But I do think that we do have to look at the history of what happened in that time before World War II and after World War II, and you know how in history we look at, you know, these great white men, you know, these great white men of history. And I don't think it is just as straightforward just to kind of focus in on Churchill, but I mean, we know, for example, he said that he hated people with slit eyes and pigtails. You know, looking at the history of Churchill and his role in terms of the British Empire, I mean, we have to remember, I mean, he described himself as a Victorian. He allied himself with different movements at different times. And in 1904, he actually crossed the floor of the House of Commons and spent almost 2 decades as a Liberal. And when he went into office, he was actually junior minister at what was known as the Colonial Office. And he was seen as quite left-wing at the time. He was seen as, you know, he was liberal, he was seen as left-wing, he was seen as radical. So when he actually came back to the Conservatives, there was an enormous amount of pressure as well for him to ally himself with die-hard imperialists, you know, at the height of the British Empire and the role that Britain was playing in the world at the time. So that's not to downplay that he, you know, held racist views, but it's also to recognize, I think, that he changed tack and changed his position in order to develop his image as he developed his career. And I think he deliberately developed his career. And there's a really interesting book called Churchill's Empire, which actually covers what was happening in that period of time. In terms of Black history in the curriculum, I mean, this isn't a new campaign. This has been actually been spoken about and campaigned on for a number of years, and it just hasn't been accepted that Black history should be a compulsory part of the curriculum. We know, for example, how it has manifested itself in terms of higher education, in terms of decolonizing the curriculum. I myself was involved in some of that in a couple of years back. But I do think it is right to call for these measures to ensure that Black history is a mandatory part of the curriculum. I don't think it should just be taught as part of history, but it should be taught as part of citizenship. It should be taught as part of, and we should be, when, even for example, mathematics, you might say, well, how? But actually, the entire way in which the curriculum is shaped needs to look at the contributions and of, say, for example, mathematicians of Black backgrounds. And I think that it's about having an overhaul of the curriculum itself, and not just containing and limiting it to looking at the curriculum in terms of history as a subject itself. In terms of wealth deprivation in the constituency and Canary Wharf, I slightly disagree, and maybe I heard incorrectly, but I don't think, when the Canary Wharf estate was being developed, that it was being seen as this great opportunity for local people. I mean, I looked at, for example, one of my predecessors maiden speeches in the 1980s. So Mildred Gordon herself spoke about the anxiety, the anxiety that local people were feeling when it was proposed that the estate would be developed, and the threat that local people felt in terms of how this would impact the local infrastructure, the pressures on local infrastructure that would bring along, and the anxiety that people felt around the local characteristics of the area potentially changing. And here we are, decades later, seeing that materialize, but also, recognizing that this is still very much a live issue. And what I would say is that I think, in terms of the campaigning around the Black curriculum itself, I mean, I've already had conversations with the front bench, so speaking with the Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, and it's something that I think I'm waiting to hear back on, in terms of whether there will be a campaign, for example, from the Labour Party on this in particular. But it's something that I've personally raised. But I also want to make sure that these are really important, pertinent sort of issues and campaigns that we should be focusing on. But I also don't want, I would advise, and I would not want to see that we get drawn into those without actually remaining focused as well in terms of the truth of what is happening right now, and how we need to organise to protect Black lives, ethnic minority lives, workers, and defend services that cater to BAME lives and make sure that BAME people are again not forced to suffer more and pay for recovery via further austerity measures in the future. In terms of, I think it was mentioned about deprivation and how I would work to make sure that it's, you know, evenly spread out or that it's distributed. I mean, I think we do need to consider where wealth is in the borough. And how decisions are made at a local level. I mean, that's essentially part of the reason why I'm very, very concerned about our rewards, for example, because the council is the biggest employer in the local borough. And to see that that's, you know, where, you know, we're going to have a disproportionate amount of people from BAME backgrounds affected by this new scheme. But I think we should also think about, I mean, you know, for example, the Westbury generic debacle has brought to light the issues around lobbying and the transparency of lobbying in this country. And I think we need to have honest conversations about that. We need to have honest conversations and a greater understanding in terms of transparency and how you know, influence is made over government and at local level and at national level, and how decisions are made. So just to give an example, I mean, for example, there's a statutory register of lobbyists that cover those who lobby government, but that's only limited to specific type of lobbyists. So it doesn't actually cover, it covers consultant lobbyists, but it doesn't cover in-house lobbyists for NGOs, industry associations, trade unions, and so forth. And why I raise this is because I think it's really important to understand the way in which decisions are made, which may in turn benefit particular organizations or associations, which then also have an impact in terms of the infrastructure locally, and in terms of the characteristics and the area and the deprivation, the levels of deprivation in the area. And just to say further, I mean, I looked into this and I was looking at, for example, I mean, the way in which information or what levels of transparency there are in the country in this area. I mean, for example, meetings with ministers, for example, there isn't much in terms of, it could be much more accurate in the way in which organizations, lobbyists meet with ministers, and they're required under ministerial code to release information on a quarterly basis as to the meetings that they've had. But, you know, they can, you know, they don't necessarily need to say the exact details of the meetings they've had. They can sort of say introductory meeting, or they can say, you know, meeting with this organization, but not really say much further. It's really, really important, I think, to look at that, to understand the way in which political donations are also made. There's something called unincorporated associations, which may also be used by lobbyists to gain access to, for example, party officials or ministers to also gain influence, and that's something that perhaps could be looked at as well. But I think, I mean, I hope I've covered that broadly at least. I hear and I take these things on board, and I will also come back to the forum with more information, particularly on the issue around the Black curriculum and learning Black history. I'd be more than happy to keep you posted on that.
Thank you, Afsana. And thanks to all our speakers, Afsana Begum, MP, Rahman, and Zita Holden, and all the participants, especially all the councillors, leaders. I'm now going to, since we're actually running out of time, especially not working now, we work at 9 o'clock, but I do apologize for this. I'm going to ask our chair, Junaid Ahmed, to actually wrap up the meeting. Over to Sundar Vijay.
Thank you, Ruhul. Okay, thank you, Ruhul. Before I could see Sajida Chaudhary, she logged in long before. Would you wish to say anything, Sajida? Hello, Sajida, can you hear me? Okay. Lastly, I want to thank my heart all the guest speakers, especially from says MP Afsana Begum. The work you're doing from your perspective, honestly speaking to you, it's fine, no problem. Carry on with the good work and keep with your promises such as grassroots politics, new kind of politics. Keep on doing that. Thank you. I would like to thank Asad Rahman to suggest us, to tell us so much about racism and all these campaigns, all these histories and stuff. I would like to thank Mike Davis just to come into this meeting and put his contribution forward. Yeah, I would like to thank Anwar Khan for his contribution, and especially 5 times leader Helal Abbas, who has devoted his childhood for this community. It is very important. Lastly, not least, I wanted to thank that one of the statue been removed from Tower Hamlet, and it is beginning, I must say. I wanted to thank from bottom of my heart that at least we start somewhere. But it is not the end. By removing a dead man's statue will not make us hero. We need to find out the lively racist to remove where they are posting, wherever they are. I am against the racist, and I will remain doing against these racist and far right, because they are not doing nothing for our community, especially BAME community. I would like to thank you all of you, just to join in. Most of the people have left now, and I believe that it is only expressing our views. It is only the beginning. We shall have more meetings, and I will finally thank all of you for contributing and giving your valuable time. Thank you very much. We are looking forward to see you again. Thank you. And I conclude the meeting now. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Sorry, Zakir Hussain.
No, I was just saying thank you. Thank you for the meeting now. I was just saying thank you.
Thank you, Zakir bhai.
And good
Sorry.
Thank you.
I think.
Thank you, Sabina.
Yeah. So I think Qazi Ruxana had. Ruxana, would you like to say something?
That's fine. We've closed the meeting. Thank you for
Okay, sorry,
organising.
Message just now. But you know, we still have participants. If you want to say. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mama, for organizing this.